One of the greatest gifts in my life is the fact that my entire existence and my childhood growing up with Dad was all captured on camera.
She stood in a ballroom full of strangers and watched her son become someone she almost couldn't recognize. Not because something had gone wrong, because something, after 19 years of quiet worry, had finally gone right. Terri Irwin has spent almost 2 decades carrying a weight most people never have to touch: widowhood, single parenthood, and the responsibility of keeping a global legacy alive for a world that never stopped watching. But on a Tuesday night in October 2025, all of that weight cracked open in public. And this time it wasn't grief that broke her. It was pride. Most people think they know Robert Irwin. They picture the small, grinning kid trailing behind Steve Irwin on a wildlife set, wrangling something with teeth. That image stuck, and for years the world was content to let it stay frozen there. While the public mourned Steve and celebrated his sister Bindi's rise, something else was quietly forming with the youngest Irwin. Something almost nobody clocked in real time. Robert Clarence Irwin was born on December 1, 2003, in Queensland, Australia, the youngest child of Steve and Terri Irwin. He was not yet 3 years old when his father was killed by a stingray barb to the chest while filming near Bat Reef, off Port Douglas, in September 2006. That means Robert has essentially no independent memory of the man the world called the Crocodile Hunter. He knows his father the way most of us do, through old footage, through the stories his mother tells, and through the way strangers' faces change the moment they realize who he is. That is a specific, strange kind of grief, mourning someone you can't actually remember losing. For years, the cameras caught Robert's enthusiasm with animals and his easy grin, but they didn't capture what was happening underneath. A kid quietly growing up in the shadow of a legend he'd never really gotten to meet. Terri has talked about those early years only in careful pieces, scattered across interviews over time, always protective of her children. She's described the disorientation of the period right after Steve's death, learning to run a zoo, raise 2 kids in public, and keep functioning at all. But she's also said, in various ways over the years, that Robert wasn't simply along for the ride. Even as a toddler, there was something in him that startled her, an ease around animals that looked less like bravery and more like instinct, the same instinct Steve had. By age 4, Robert was already appearing on television alongside his mother and sister. Audiences started noticing what Terri had quietly clocked years earlier. This wasn't a child performing for a camera. It was something that ran deeper than mimicry. Nobody really prepares you for the moment when the child of someone who died young and publicly starts to become them, not metaphorically, but in a way that stops you mid-sentence. Terri has spoken more than once about moments where Robert tilts his head a certain way or lights up describing an animal, and it becomes almost impossible to separate the present from the past. She has described it as something that arrives with both joy and grief at once, tangled so tightly they can't be pulled apart. As Robert moved through his teenage years, longtime fans of the Irwin family started pointing out a resemblance to Steve that went beyond appearance. The same build, the same restless energy on camera, the same total ease around animals that would make most trained adults pause. It didn't look performed. It looked genetic. By 2024, Robert had started speaking publicly about his father with a level of emotional depth that caught interviewers off guard. What it meant to grow up as the son of a man who'd become a father figure to an entire generation of strangers, not just his own family. There was real grief tucked underneath the gratitude, and he didn't try to hide it. For Terri, hearing her son articulate that kind of perspective at his age in public was one more of those moments where pride and pain arrived together and refused to separate. There's a version of this story where Robert becomes well known simply for existing, for being Steve Irwin's son and doing just enough to keep the name alive. The public would have accepted that version easily. Instead, Robert built something that was recognizably his own while still honoring everything that came before him. By his early teens, he was making regular appearances on The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon, bringing exotic animals into the studio and handling them with a composure that consistently surprised audiences. He wasn't playing a character or leaning on his last name. He was simply himself, informed, funny, and visibly moved by the conservation message he was carrying. in a way that couldn't be manufactured. Then came the photography. Robert turned a personal passion into serious work, with wildlife images shown in galleries internationally. In 2020, he won first place in a major wildlife photography competition for an image of an Australian forest devastated by bushfire, a photograph that didn't just document loss. It made viewers feel it before they'd fully processed what they were looking at. And then, almost out of nowhere, came Dancing with the Stars. Robert joined season 34 of Dancing with the Stars in September 2025, partnered with professional dancer Whitney Carson, who had won the Mirror Ball once before, back in season 19, with a partner who would go on to co-host the very show Robert was now competing on. He came in, by his own admission, with no dance experience at all, and no real idea what he was walking into. Week after week, something clicked that went beyond technique. Robert brought a kind of storytelling to the floor that judges and audiences responded to in ways that visibly surprised even the show's own production team. On October 14, 2025, the show aired its Dedication Night episode, where each remaining contestant performed for someone who had shaped their life. Robert chose his mother. In the rehearsal package that aired before the dance, he described Terri as the person who had shaped who he is today, and said that at every milestone where he found himself quietly wishing his father were there, she was there instead, and that had been enough. He also spoke candidly about how hard it still was for him to process losing his dad. Robert and Carson performed a contemporary routine to Phil Collins' "You'll Be in My Heart." Near the end, Carson stepped aside, and Terri walked onto the floor in a yellow dress to join her son for the final moments, the two of them embracing as the ballroom reacted. Bindi, watching nearby, came out to join them. The judges, including Derek Hoff, Bruno Tonioli, and Carrie Inaba, were visibly emotional. The routine scored 35 out of 40. In the days before the performance, Robert had posted on Instagram that the week had been an emotional one in rehearsals, writing that the dance was for his mother, for anyone who had lost someone, and for the strong mothers everywhere who deserve recognition. Terri replied publicly that she was deeply honored her son had thought of her. Afterward, she posted a video of the performance with a caption calling herself blessed to be his mother. Robert, for his part, told press afterward that he believed his father would have felt enormous pride watching Terri be honored that way. Just weeks earlier, on the anniversary of Steve's death in November, Robert had also performed a tribute dance alongside Bindi, echoing a routine she had used to honor their father a decade before on the very same show. It was, by any measure, a season built as much on grief and memory as it was on choreography. By the time the season 34 finale arrived on November 25, 2025, Robert Irwin had stopped being a novelty entry writing his family name. He had become one of the stories of the season. Complicating the finale was a genuine injury. Robert had strained the intercostal muscles between his ribs in the lead-up to the finale, making it painful simply to breathe deeply, let alone dance 3 routines in one night. He and Carson adjusted where they could and pushed through the rest. Speaking to Good Morning America the morning after, Robert put it simply. The win, he said, was painful but worth it. The finale itself drew one of the most engaged audiences the show had seen in years, with more than 72 million votes cast in a single night. Robert and Carson closed out the competition with a quick-step, an Argentine tango, and a freestyle number that earned some of the highest scores of the night, ultimately claiming the Len Goodman Mirrorball Trophy. It marked almost exactly 10 years since Bindi Irwin had won the same competition with her own partner in 2015, a symmetry that no one in that ballroom, least of all Terri, seemed to miss. In interviews that followed, Robert reflected on what the season had meant, describing a real state of shock even after the trophy was in his hands. He spoke about his mother again, crediting her with holding the family together after Steve's death and calling her strength something the world had probably underestimated all along. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the surviving parent in a story the whole world is watching. You carry the grief privately because you also have to carry the children, and the children can't watch you fall apart completely, not in the ways you might need to. Terri has navigated nearly 20 years of that with a composure the public often mistook for simple strength, when the more honest word might have been necessity. Watching Robert stand on that stage week after week and build something entirely his own out of all the weight he'd inherited, that was different. For a few months, in front of millions of strangers, someone else was doing some of the holding. Robert had spent his whole life being introduced as Steve Irwin's son. By the end of that season, for the first time, in front of an audience of millions, he was simply Robert Irwin, grieving, funny, fearless, and unmistakably himself, with his father's echo running underneath every single thing he did rather than standing in front of it. Steve Irwin once said his ultimate goal was to eventually step back and hand the mission to the next generation. That being able to do that would be the real measure of whether he'd succeeded. He never got the chance to see it happen. He was 44 when he died, and Robert was 2, and the whole weight of that unfinished sentence landed on Terri instead. 19 years later, in a ballroom in Los Angeles, holding a trophy and talking about his mother with a kind of clear-eyed gratitude that usually takes a lifetime to earn, Robert Irwin gave her something back. Terri had kept it together long enough for this exact moment to exist. And for one night, in front of the whole world, she finally didn't have to pretend it hadn't cost her anything.